The house was quiet, as it often was these days. Richard had taken to spending most of his evenings buried in his work or the newspaper, leaving Julia to her thoughts. Tonight, however, the silence felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Jake was coming home. The sound of his car pulling into the driveway broke through her haze of thought. Julia stood by the window, watching as he stepped out of the car. It had been 2 years since he'd last visited, and the transformation in him was striking. The lanky, awkward teenager was gone, replaced by a confident, composed young man. His shoulders were broader, his jaw more defined, but his eyes, those carried the same mix of intensity and vulnerability she had always noticed. "Julia," he called as he approached the door, his deep voice echoing through the quiet evening. He hadn't called her mom since the day they'd met, a detail she'd long since grown used to, though it still stung. "Hey, Jake," she replied, her voice soft as she opened the door. She wanted to embrace him, but his reserved demeanor stopped her. Instead, they exchanged a brief smile before he stepped inside. Richard barely looked up from his chair in the living room as Jake entered. The tension between them was palpable. "How's school?" Richard asked, his tone perfunctory, like it was a duty he had to fulfill. "Fine," Jake replied curtly, his eyes already drifting toward Julia. She could sense his frustration, the years of unresolved conflict between father and son still simmering beneath the surface. Dinner was a quiet affair. Julia tried to fill the silence with questions about Jake's studies and his life at college, but his responses were short and guarded. Meanwhile, Richard remained detached, only speaking to comment on the news or the food. Jake's gaze, however, often lingered on Julia, his expressions unreadable. She tried to dismiss it as him simply being observant, but something about the way he looked at her felt different. "You've changed," she said, attempting to lighten the mood. Jake glanced up, his lips curling into a faint smile. "So have you," he replied, his tone neutral but weighted. Julia hesitated, unsure how to respond. The conversation drifted back to trivialities, but the undercurrent of tension remained. After dinner, Richard folded his napkin and stood up. "I'll be upstairs if anyone needs me," he said, not waiting for a reply. His exit left Julia and Jake alone at the table. The silence between them was heavier now, filled with unspoken thoughts. "Let's watch a movie," Julia suggested, desperate to break the awkwardness. Jake nodded, following her into the living room. They settled on the couch, the soft glow of the television casting flickering shadows across the room. Julia tried to focus on the film, but she could feel Jake's presence beside her, his attention seemingly more on her than the screen. At one point, their arms brushed. It was a small, innocuous touch, but Julia felt her pulse quicken. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, only to find him looking directly at her. His gaze was intense, almost searching, and she quickly turned back to the screen, trying to steady her breathing. "Julia," he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. She turned to him, her heart racing. "Yes?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering to her lap before meeting hers again. "Do you ever regret it?" The question caught her off guard. "Regret what?" she asked, though she already knew what he meant. "Marrying him, staying here." Julia sighed, her chest tightening. "Jake, your father." "He's not my father," Jake interrupted, his voice sharp. "He's just the man who happened to be around." She didn't know what to say. The bitterness in his voice was raw, and for a moment, she saw the wounded boy he used to be. "It's complicated," she finally said. "Relationships are always complicated." Jake leaned forward slightly, closing the small gap between them. His hand moved, hesitating for a moment before brushing against her leg. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through Julia. Her breath caught as she froze, unsure of how to react. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers lingered, tracing a line down her knee. "I don't know why I feel this way," he said, his voice low and filled with something she couldn't name. "But I can't stop." Julia's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. She had spent years nurturing him, protecting him, trying to bridge the gap left by his fractured relationship with Richard. But this was something else entirely. "Stop," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't right." He looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion and something else, longing, pain, she couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," he muttered, pulling his hand back. I don't know what to do with these feelings. You have to let them go," Julia said firmly, finding her voice. "This isn't who we are, Jake. It can't be." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Jake nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he leaned back into the couch. The distance between them felt insurmountable now, but Julia knew it was necessary. That night, Julia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She knew she had made the right choice, but the pain of it lingered. She had spent so long trying to be everything for Jake, a mother, a guide, a safe haven, that she hadn't noticed the boundaries blurring until it was almost too late. The next morning, Jake was quiet as he packed his things. "I think I'll head back early," he said, not meeting her eyes. Julia nodded, her throat tightening. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. As his car pulled out of the driveway, Julia stood by the window, watching until he disappeared from view. The house felt even quieter now, but for the first time, she welcomed the silence. It was a reminder that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how blurred they might seem.